the very first time the client visits the server, the client says, "Hey computer, give me a web page." And the server says, "Okay, here's the web page. Oh, and by the way, here's a cookie." And the client is supposed to store this cookie in its cache somewhere. And then when the client goes to visit the server again, when he visits another web page, the client is supposed to say, "Oh, and here's my cookie." And the server says, "Oh, it's you." That's how these stateless servers recognize who they're talking to. You're the same guy that asked me about this other page over here. And you're asking me for another page, so there's no reason to make you log in again because you logged in just a moment ago. So somewhere on the server side, there's this massive database that has everything they know about you. All of your friends, all of your social media stuff, everything that you're connected to. And how do they know which one you are? Well, the cookie is the primary key that allows them to look up your personal information. So whenever you visit that server and do stuff on that server, they're adding more data about you as entries into this database, and they're all indexed by the cookie. And the cookie is what you keep reporting to them to tell them, this is who I am, so you can look up my private data. So all that information is probably right here inside the server's database. The only thing that they put on your computer is the cookie, and the cookie is usually a unique identifier that helps them look up in the database. So, for example, if this were Facebook's database, they've got an entry there for every user that's ever used Facebook. That's a friggin' big database. Now, if some user visits Facebook based on the cookie, well, first they determine who you are by type in your username and password. But as soon as they've authenticated you, then there's a cookie on your computer. And that cookie says, hey, I'm that guy who just typed in their username and password. And that's going to be a lookup into this database where they're going to store more information they gather about you, and where they store who your friends are, and what groups you're a member of, and what pages you've made, and all that type of information. So everything's still on the server. It's just this unique identifier is on your client, and that's the cookie. Yeah. Yep. If you go to a different server, they're not allowed. So your browser is the one that controls the cookies, right? And your browser, when it goes to Google, will send it the cookie that Google gave it. And when it goes to Facebook, it'll send it the cookie that Facebook gave it. So your web browser has a file system or a database somewhere that probably has 2,000 cookies in it because you have been to 2,000 different servers. And it's up to the server to pick the cookie. And if the server says, hey, give me Facebook's cookie, then the client will say, no, you're not Facebook. It only gives Facebook's cookie to Facebook and Google's cookie to Google and so forth. And that way they can't hijack your session. There is a thing called a third-party cookie. And this is a nasty, dumb thing that you should totally turn off. It's on by default on all of your browsers. Here's what a third-party cookie is. So here's a web page. I know with me, everything is a square. I apologize. I'm lazy. On this web page, there's probably a little banner ad down here or somewhere. Or maybe it's over here in the right column. That's kind of where they put ads these days, isn't it? And there's a little bit of text that's probably there by AdSense. Well, here's the thing. This page came from this server. But where did these ads come from? Well, way over here, there's another server named Google who is supplying ads for the server. So there's actually a connection between the server and Google so that they can say, hey, I need an ad, so they can stick it on their web page so they can give the ad to you, right? Well, Google actually sends them a little snip of code to include in their web page. And that snip of code is responsible for this ad. What a third-party cookie allows them to do is it allows this snip of code that actually came from Google to store a Google cookie on your computer. What this means is every web page in the world that uses AdSense or Google Ads that you visit actually gets the Google cookie sent all the way back to Google. And this is a third-party cookie. So it basically means Google knows where you've been. It knows everywhere you've been because almost every web page in the world wants to monetize by putting ads on themselves. So how do you disable third-party cookies? You go to google.com and you type in, how do I disable third-party cookies? And Google will help you disable their bread and butter. Oh, by the way, the first thing you want to install whenever you install a browser is AdBlock Plus or something like thereunto. That's the thing that makes this little logo right there in the corner. And that makes all the ads on the internet go away. And it makes all the news sites grumpy and they pop up this, we see you're using an ad blocker. Please disable it for us. And you know what I do? Ignore them because I don't care. It will make your internet experience faster. You don't need to see ads. This is way better than blocking third-party cookies anyway because it blocks the whole dumb ad. And as a basic internet user, you should know that you need an ad blocker in every browser, especially if there are children in the home. It's important. Okay. So having said that, there's a third-party cookie, and yeah, you should disable them too, and I never do because I install this. And that probably doesn't block all the third-party cookies. But there's another thing you should be aware of. Remember how your browser is sending personal information to the server? There's another way they can get personal information. On the web page, they can insert a little bit of JavaScript code, right? And you know all about JavaScript, don't you? Well, guess what JavaScript can do? It can query things like which fonts are installed on your computer, and what's the width of your computer screen, and the height of your computer screen, and what was the last application you opened, and what was the last website you visited, and a whole bunch of personal information. Well, guess what every site in the world is doing right now? They're writing JavaScript that sends all the private information they can gather about your computer onto their servers. Why? So they can add them to their databases of everything they know about you, so they can sell it and make money. And it's all going to be indexed by that cookie that's on your client machine, which your browser is faithfully reporting to every server you visit, and if you stop, your web experience will stink. And so you're going to keep giving them cookies because you will hate the web if you turn cookies off. Okay. Doesn't that feel creepy and spooky now? Well, using all the information your browser gives it, plus all the information that JavaScript is just delighted to hand over to your server, they can create what's called a web fingerprint. I'll write that here, web fingerprint. Basically, has anybody heard of a one-way hash? But they take all the information about your the size of your screen, the number of fonts installed on your machine, etc., and they digest it to make a magic number that uniquely identifies you. And because of that, even if you turn off cookies, they can still fingerprint you. And if you turn off JavaScript, they can still fingerprint you because your your web browser still reports unique information to the server. And if you use a special secure web browser that doesn't report any information to the server, there's also a thing called a super cookie, which can use things like Adobe Flash to backdoor your machine and store cookies that you can't even clear by clearing your cookies, and lots of other things. Basically, the web is the wild, wild west, and people have exploited it to all kinds of ridiculous extents to track you and understand what's going on with you because it all has value, and there, you should be aware of it, and now you are aware of it. And yeah, you can partially mitigate it by turning off JavaScript, but then the web will suck. And you can turn off cookies, and the web will suck too. And you can turn off third-party cookies, and that will have no adverse consequences to you. And you can install ad blockers, and the only consequence is the news sites will hate you. But unless you feel beholden to pay for their services, that's no big deal. You can add exceptions to them if you feel guilty. But if you really don't want to be tracked, you can use what's it called? Incognito mode. If you go into incognito mode, there's kind of a stigma with it because everyone assumes, ooh, you're in incognito mode, you must be doing porn. Well, what does incognito mode do? When the server says, here's a cookie, incognito mode says, thanks, and throws it in the garbage. And so you're going to basically have to type in your password a lot. If they give you JavaScript, what does incognito mode do? It runs it. And JavaScript will report a bunch of personal information. And depending on how good your server is, they'll totally know who you are anyway. So yeah, as much as you like to think you're private, don't trust it. That private browsing thing doesn't work. Now, it's kind of an arms race. Modern browsers have worked really hard to basically, when you're in incognito mode, the JavaScript is sort of semi-disabled so that it only reports some of the information the servers want. So maybe they can't track you as well as they could before. Or if they're really smart, they might make up random garbage information and send it to the server, and that'll confuse their one-way hashes, so they won't know who you are. So maybe they can work around it. But then guess what? Servers are smart too, and they've got money on the line. So they've hired very knowledgeable individuals to find careful ways of working around incognito mode. And yeah, it's an arms race. If you really want to be secure, don't use the internet or something like that. And if you want, but hey, incognito mode's probably more secure than regular mode, because regular mode just stores cookies and everything that it asks you to do. So there's some more information about the web and how it works. Has anybody ever heard of a fun little tool called Wireshark? There's a tool called Wireshark. It's an open source product that basically sniffs whatever passes over the web. Well, see all of this information? If you were to use Wireshark and plug it into a router, you'd see all of this stuff for what your, well, if you plug it into a hub, you'll see all of this information for what everyone in the room is browsing on the internet. And if you were to, say, pick up all the Wi-Fi signals passing through the air, you could use Wireshark to get this kind of HTTP gobbledygook for what's going on. How could that be useful? Well, you notice how right here in the HTTP headers are these cookies. You could hijack somebody's cookies. Has anybody ever heard of session hijacking? Well, session hijacking means you use some program. Wireshark is just one example. There are many of them. And you use it to sniff the cookies that pass through the air. So imagine this. Somebody's on Facebook, and you're sniffing the Wi-Fi signal that passes through, and you know how to read HTTP because you took my class. And you read down here and you say, aha, I got their cookie. And then you go plug that cookie into your program, which knows how to impersonate a browser, because we wrote a browser, right? And you go to Facebook, and they say, give me your cookie, and you give them this cookie. What's going to happen? You're logged in as that person. Cool, huh? And so the gears in your head start turning, and you think, hey, I can impersonate people and post naughty things on their behalf, and so on and so forth. Well, it turns out session hijacking was a really big deal 20 years ago. Well, 10 years, kind of until the last few years, because banks have pretty much solved it. They all switched to HTTPS, but it wasn't until the last few years that all the websites started to realize, you know, we really need to be using HTTPS. So there's a thing called HTTP. You know how the first thing you type in your URL bar is HTTP://. Any idea what that means? Yeah. That's the language the browser should speak when talking to the server. That's why you type that, is you're saying, hey, browser, in this language, visit this server and do a GET request for this page. And now you know how to read a URL. The first thing is the language, the second thing is the host name or the server, and the last thing is the file name. And it always does a GET request, because whatever is in this URL bar does a GET request. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, there's another language called HTTPS. Secure. The S stands for secure, and what that means is they're going to encrypt all of the HTTP gobbledygook. So when you try to get the cookie, you're just going to get encrypted garbage, and that means you can't hijack the sessions. And you see why that's kind of important? Especially if you do online banking when you're inside of a Starbucks. So hopefully these days every website on the planet uses HTTPS, and HTTP is now dead. No one should be using HTTP. Let me just say, hey, as American citizens, as people who support the Constitution and the First Amendment and all of that, stand up for encryption. Why? As long as there's encryption, you can say stuff the government doesn't like. Now, they're going to keep saying, oh, it's so important for security and to stop terrorists and all these things. We must get rid of encryption. We must have our officials have backdoors into your HTTP connections. That's bull. Anybody tells you that, they are bad people. Encryption is very, very important. You should always use HTTPS whenever possible. If anyone tells you that the government needs a backdoor to your stuff, stand up and fight. Okay? There are a lot of issues not worth fighting for. This is one of those issues that is. This is important.